Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine looking more and more imminent, as Russian troops are now within just 3 miles of the border. And check out this new satellite imaging. It shows convoys and tanks hidden in civilian areas and forests. Plus, we're learning that Moscow's battle plan calls for an overwhelming intensity of fire on Ukraine, one the U.S. warns could kill tens of thousands in just the first few days. This is the Kremlin now insist it's too early to talk about a Putin-Biden summit. At the same time, Russia is also said to be preparing a hit list of assassination targets that include political figures and activists in Ukraine. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan warned this morning about the scope and magnitude of Russia's plan.
Well, we believe that any military operation of the size, scope, and magnitude of what we believe the Russians are planning will be extremely violent. It will cost the lives of Ukrainians and Russians, civilians and military personnel alike. But we also have intelligence to suggest that there will be an even greater form of brutality, because this will not simply be some conventional war between two armies. It will be a war waged by Russia on the Ukrainian people to repress them, to crush them, to harm them.
Brian, on Friday, I watched our commander-in-chief say, I am convinced that Vladimir Putin has made the decision to invade. The next day, you had Zelensky come out, the president of Ukraine, saying, OK, you're so convinced he's going to invade. Why not levy sanctions? Now seems like the perfect time. And Brian, I just can't help but think of the analogy of, like, if your house is on fire and flames going high into the sky, that's the time you call the fire department and take action. But not for President Joe Biden.
Yeah, this is nonsensical to me. I do not understand why this administration is waiting, telling us all of the terrible things that can happen, but not putting out a timeline, not putting out expectations. What do we need to see? What's in America's interest, and what are we prepared to do about it if we don't get it? Putin is calling all the plays right now. He is in charge. He's made that clear. And our president has done nothing to give America leverage here. Putin speaks the language of leverage. And right now he has all of it, because this administration is backwards on energy. It's backward on sanctions right now. It was backward in Afghanistan. And we are going nowhere fast because we have no leverage.
Yeah, backwards on energy, like let's close down Keystone, but green light the Russia pipeline. You know, Rebeccah, late last night, Jen Psaki comes out with this statement that, you know, in principle, the president has agreed to a summit with Putin. It was brokered by French President Macron. It was a really curious development. And then, of course, Vladimir Putin comes out this morning, throws water on that idea. He says, Dmitry Petrov, a spokesperson, it's premature to talk about any specific plans. And then Sebastian Smith over at AFP saying that Putin said we are at a dead end, simply at a dead end. So very different messaging than what we're hearing from the White House.
That's exactly right. You know, Vladimir Putin is the one who's calling all the shots. He holds all the cards. And it's getting to the point where it's actually embarrassing to watch all of these heads of state going to him desperate for some kind of diplomatic solution, when it's totally clear to anybody watching this that Vladimir Putin's not interested in a peaceful diplomatic solution. His demands are outrageous. 150,000 plus troops, of course, on the border. And the other thing, too, is there's already cause right now to implement some sanctions. Belarus has already said that they want Russia to leave. Russia's not leaving. You have cyber attacks ongoing against Ukrainian targets. And so many of these sanctions that the Biden administration is threatening to impose if there is further invasion are sanctions that they themselves have already relieved. And so there should already be heavy sanctions in place for what the Russians have already done. That would demonstrate seriousness, some resolve, and those sanctions can only accelerate as the Russians accelerate their aggression. That's what we should be doing. The Russians understand strength and power.
No doubt. Rebeccah, let me quickly follow up with you as our expert here. You know, I saw this in the Washington Post, and it raised some eyebrows. You know, President Biden's so certain of this invasion. It's happening, and certainly the images are ominous. The buildup on the border, of course, ominous. But the Washington Post saying this, that high-level European officials have expressed frustration that the United States had not shared the intelligence that led us to surmise Russia's intentions with such certainty. Why wouldn't we share that intelligence?
well, we should be sharing that intelligence. I think that there's a fear here that some of our sources and methods could be leaked, but the more we share it with other people, even if they're allies, and then that puts people in danger who are the ones that are helping the United States understand with great specificity about what might happen. But the point remains, I mean, the whole world is basically being held hostage by Vladimir Putin, and he's jerking the United States around. He's jerking heads of states of other NATO allies around. This can only go on for so long. I mean, it's psychological warfare. I mean, these poor Ukrainians, they've been training so much, and they're ready to defend themselves. They're ready to exact high casualties against the Russians, even if they can't ultimately defeat them militarily. And so it's draining it's harming the Ukrainian economy already. So Russia's already harming Ukraine as we speak. And so it's really incumbent on our administration to do the best they can to let our allies and partners know what is going on. And they're going to have to come up with another plan, because this cannot go on forever. I mean, the Russians are just holding the world hostage as they continue to squeeze the Ukrainians and hold all of us attention. And of course, we haven't even talked about China yet. The Chinese have lots to gain by this conflict. And so, the Chinese are the ones that are collaborating with the Russian government as well, especially on timing. I think now that the Olympics are over, now would be the time for the Russians to launch accelerated invasion.
Yeah, and Emily, you look at those images of Russian tanks, but it's not just the physical threat coming from Russia, it's cybersecurity as well here at home.
That's exactly right. So, Rebecca, I have a question for you. You mentioned cyber attacks against Ukraine earlier in your first answer, but U.S. officials and citizens are growing increasingly concerned about a potential devastating Russian cyber attack here at home, especially and including on banking institutions. So what can you tell us about that?
No, that's a great question. The Russians, the Russians have been launching cyber attacks against the United States major supply chains. Remember, leading up this whole year in which the Biden administration has been in power, there have already been major Russian-connected cyber attacks against the meat industry, against energy banking. And so, and the Biden administration has not exacted sanctions against the Russians. So whenever there isn't a high penalty for those actions that have already happened, it doesn't dissuade the Russians from continuing to do that. So the Americans are at great risk too, economically from a potential invasion here, but also with ongoing cyber attacks as well.
Yeah, but no one should worry, because we have Vice President Kamala Harris going to help the situation. Let's listen to this soundbite from her. She's certain Russia's invading, but sanctions might deter them. Let's play the tape.
The purpose of the sanctions has always been and continues to be deterrence. These are some of the greatest sanctions, if not the strongest, that we've ever issued.
But if Putin has made up his mind, do you feel that this threat that has been looming is really going to deter him?
Absolutely. We strongly believe. And remember also that the sanctions are a product not only of our perspective as the United States, but a shared perspective among our allies. Within the context of a diplomatic path still being open, the deterrence effect, we believe, has merit.
Leslie, are you convinced the vice president can stop a war?
I don't think that it is up to one individual, our vice president or any, to stop this war. But I do believe 362 Russian scholars who have said 90% of them agree sanctions will work. But it's not just
so
the
why not
sanctions,
do them now?
It's which sanction, and one of which is if you cut off the access for Russia to SWIFT Bank, for example, that will reduce Russia's GDP by 5%. When we look historically, and when we look at what Vladimir Putin is doing, historically, what has he done? False propaganda, right? Mini cyber attacks that escalate.
Leslie, you're making the case that we need to have sanctions now.
Where he is now.
Leslie, you're making the case we need sanctions now, not later.
I'm getting to that, Kaylee. I'm getting to that, Kaylee. You guys asked me a question. Please let me answer. When Vladimir Putin is threatened, as he would feel with sanctions imposed, it actually could make him make a decision that we don't want. It could veer him away from diplomacy. So it's not just sanctions, it's when sanctions are placed and where sanctions are placed, which is what I was saying. Vladimir Putin said today in his security meeting, the decision will be made today. So clearly, he hasn't 100% made that decision. And clearly, we all think in the United States, what are we constantly hearing? NATO, NATO, NATO. We're not talking about Slavs who have freedom on the Russian border, which angers Vladimir Putin as well. And in addition to that, the list of Vladimir Putin's demands are, it was said earlier, outrageous. He knows that they can't be met.
Leslie,
Part
I
of
think,
this is a middle
Leslie,
finger
we
to the
gotta-
Western world, which I have to remind, the Western world holds more than 50% of the world's economy. Russia, and if you combine their buddies China together,
All right, Leslie,
less than 20%.
we got to wrap up here.
We
Let me
have
quickly
financial
respond to what
power.
you said. The facts are clear. President Obama is the commander-in-chief. Putin gets Crimea. President Trump's the commander-in-chief. 4 years. Sanctions like you've never seen before. Putin backs off. President Biden comes in. Here we go. Ukraine may be no longer an independent nation, thanks to the weakness of this administration.